Okay, I think we can get started now. I just wanted to welcome everyone this evening. I'm Janine Casey, Associate Director of Alumni Relations, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's presentation, What the Pandemic is Teaching Us About Sustainability, as part of our ConnectEd Virtual Learning Community Series. The entire Alumni Relations Department appreciates you taking time out of your busy professional and personal lives to connect with Lafayette tonight. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, please know that we have utilized the audience mute feature in order to ensure that the presentation is not interrupted by any background noise. We also suggest you turn your video off to avoid being on camera in the gallery during the presentation. We welcome questions and ask that you use the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions that you may have. I'd now like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Kira Lawrence, the John H. Markle Professor of Geology and Environmental Geosciences, and Delicia Nahman, Director of Sustainability. Kira and Delicia, I turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. I want to talk to you about what the pandemic is teaching us about sustainability, and we really appreciate this opportunity to share a short presentation and then have a Q&A with all of you. As awful as the COVID-19 pandemic has been for global human health and for economies all over the world, many of us in the environmental community see it as a harbinger of things to come in the future with regards to environmental crises that are upon us and will deepen in the years to come. You can see that sentiment depicted here in this cartoon where that is dubbed the preliminary round, where the Earth is duking it out in the ring with COVID-19, and they're similarly sized. And then there is a larger climate change waiting in the wings for its chance at planet Earth. This image may be familiar to many of you. It is a screenshot of the New York Times' map of the number of COVID-19 cases the world over. And it is, as if you're familiar with it, being updated every day. And we're seeing the numbers of cases dramatically rise. So we're nearing 9 million cases worldwide and almost 500,000 deaths. The other main metric that has been used to measure the COVID-19 pandemic is the impact on the world's economy. And so just two statistics, which won't do it justice, but the World Bank predicts that the global economy will contract by slightly more than 5% this year. And in the United States, unemployment has soared above 40 million people. As I need not tell you, by basically any measure, the COVID-19 pandemic has upended a life all over this planet in a very substantial way. We are, I think, learning each day from what this pandemic can teach us. And I'll say to you as a scientist, one of the most resounding messages to me is that the nations who paid attention to their public health officials and the doctors and scientists about how to respond to this virus and took swift action in an effort to mitigate the impact, they fared much better than the nation states that did not. And so for me, as someone who is a scientist myself, that message is very, very loudly heard, that we need to heed the warnings of scientists who are seeking to warn policymakers about potential risks that arise as a consequence of human activities and as a consequence of the world that we live in. This dramatic event of the COVID-19 pandemic is overlain on a suite of very serious environmental issues that have arisen as a consequence of human activity. So this slide shows us a spectrum of different impacts that people are having on the Earth system. And some systems are in more dramatic dire circumstances than others. Many of the impacts that people are having on the planet are irreversible, and biodiversity loss, as well as eutrophication of many of our waterways as a consequence of excess nutrients in our aquatic systems, are acute problems, as is human-induced climate change. Because there are a lot of ties between climate change and the pandemic, we're going to use climate change as a case study. But I guess one of the final points that I wish to emphasize here is that in many key areas, we are nearing or have already exceeded some of the thresholds for these systems, and that will have significant adverse impacts on human societies in the years to come. So, for many of you who are familiar with the climate system, what I'm about to say will be something you probably already know. But for the sake of being accessible to all listeners, the climate crisis is upon us as a consequence of warming greenhouse gases that are warming Earth's atmosphere, and their concentration has been on the rise since the start of the Industrial Revolution as a consequence of human activities. And we have blown past the 400 parts per million mark of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we are rapidly moving towards 450 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. That corresponds to the 2 degrees Celsius threshold that the Paris Climate Agreement seeks to avoid. And the reason the threshold in the Paris Climate Agreement is set there is that there are monsters that are lurking behind the closet door. All joking aside, there are very serious tipping points that await us if we fail to act and act swiftly to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Among them, tropical famine, mass extinction, and eventually significant sea level rise that will threaten coastal cities most everywhere in the world as a consequence of melting ice sheets. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change come to roost in more powerful storms that have us measuring rainfall in feet rather than inches, and in dramatic wildfires that are unprecedented in intensity and extent, which have had serious adverse effects on human civilizations, probably most recently and most notably in Australia in the winter season for us and in their summer season. At the intersection of COVID-19 and the environment, we see a significant decline in some pollutants as a consequence of the pandemic. And so this is a figure showing you the concentration of nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. And you can see this is during January of 2020 on the left-hand part of the slide, and during February, the depths of the lockdown on the right-hand portion of the slide. The orange or the yellow and red colors are showing higher concentrations of this pollutant, which is a consequence of burning fossil fuels, contributes to smog and acid rain, as well as depleting the ozone layer. And then during the depths of the pandemic, we see the blue colors indicating much lower concentrations of this pollutant in the atmosphere. This is an easy pollutant to measure from satellite. The same is true for many other pollutants, including greenhouse gases. During the height of the lockdown in China, about a quarter of all of China's emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, China's greenhouse gas emissions were about a quarter lower than they normally are. If we pull the lens back a little bit and we look at the numbers globally, global carbon emissions dropped by 17% relative to last year during the depth of the lockdown in early April. That's when China, India, and the United States all had significant restrictions on their economies and on mobility of their citizens. In that depth of that lockdown, there were big declines in emissions from the transportation sector, as well as the power and industrial sectors. Those are sectors that those in the climate community were focused on, but this is a clear signal that those are places where dramatic emissions reductions are needed and can happen. This decrease in greenhouse gas emissions is likely temporary. We are returning by year's end. The predictions are close to 2019 levels, somewhere between a 4% and 8% drop relative to last year. From the standpoint of the climate crisis, this is something that needs to happen year over year for the next 30 years in order for us to meet the Paris climate targets. Of course, the dramatic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on human health and the economy are not directions that we want to head in order to solve the climate crisis. But the pandemic does illustrate that significant emissions reductions are possible. Again, I bet you're thinking, gosh, but there is untold economic hardship. But I wish to say that for decades, there are scientists and engineers who have been working to develop technological innovations that will allow us to transition our energy economy away from a carbon-intensive future, away from fossil fuels, towards renewables and clean energy that will allow us to have this scope of emissions reductions year after year in the future if we are able to implement those changes through policy changes in the years to come. So I'm going to turn it over to Delicia now, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about some of the lessons of the pandemic. I just want to reiterate as a scientist, from my standpoint, the biggest take-home message is we need to listen to the people who are experts in this area, and then we need to have policymakers act swiftly in response to that advice in order to protect the public good.
Thanks, Kira. So seeing as sustainability requires living within the Earth's ecosystems while also ensuring a social foundation of well-being, this pandemic, a small probability event, did demonstrate to us that all the areas of sustainability require our renewed attention. These lessons are certainly varied, but we do want to acknowledge the many crucial social equity components of sustainability that were further negatively impacted. Indeed, COVID-19 exacerbated many of the socioeconomic insecurities and racial inequalities that already needed our attention and action. These lessons touch on aligning food insecurity with food waste and excess food, addressing global supply chain disruptions, racial inequalities in healthcare and housing, access, and more. Just some specific examples that can be seen both through the headlines that you're seeing and also were carried in reporting starting in February to now. The bottom quarter of the American population consists of 3/4 of COVID cases. Excuse me, as a microcosm, Black people in New York City are twice as likely to die from COVID as whites. Our food supply chain is far weaker and less resilient than we perhaps would have hoped. You may have seen shortages in some types of food. Yeast, for example, was flying off the shelves, while in other parts of the country, farmers were tilling under crops or euthanizing otherwise healthy pigs. Food prices soared amid the pandemic, including red meat, which increased almost 12%. And considering that about 40% of food is wasted normally, this pandemic, which has led to food pantries going empty, is a glaring example of the crucial food supply inefficiencies and a call to action. Another lesson is really that businesses across the world, regardless of industry, had significant disruptions to their product supply chains, from tech companies to healthcare supply companies. Many of these COVID cases demonstrate that the least responsible in creating the problems are the most impacted, which is also true for environmental challenges as well. And so along the same lines, low probability but high impact health scenarios like the pandemic that require planning and action are very similar to low probability climate events that also require, again, our renewed attention. The biggest lesson out of this pandemic is really the fragility and lack of resilience in our ecosystems and human created systems like supply chains and healthcare access that really ensure the social foundation of well-being, and that these really require our immediate attention again. And yet at the same time, there were some silver linings. So next slide, Kira. Certainly one of the big lessons, as Kira has said, but I want to reiterate, is that we shouldn't have to have economic hardship to get the sustainability outcomes that we need in order to survive within our Earth systems. So there is a small glimmer of hope. This cartoon that you can see just calls out some of the silver linings. So we saw a decrease in industrial pollution, air and automobile travel, litter on the streets. We also started to see some small micro changes in human behavior. So more people were out spending time outside, especially when the weather got nice. They started making bread or picked up other hobbies. There were increases in community supported agriculture memberships. And luckily, views on climate change have actually not fallen due to the virus, according to the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. And so all of this gives us some sense of hope. But there are certainly some questions that we can still ask ourselves, like, how can we help industries recover while ensuring racial and socioeconomic inequalities are addressed, at the same time that we are also focusing on climate adaptation initiatives. So what would it look like, for example, to help the auto industry recover, but ensure that maybe there was some support tied to the production of electric cars or better battery storage, help the energy industry continue moving towards the complete transition to renewable energies. Putting people back to work could mean installing more electric car charging stations or more rooftop solar panels, better home insulation, smart meters, more efficient windows and boilers, especially in low-income communities, but really everywhere across the US really needs all of these things. So really what this tells us out of these silver linings and this sense of hope, next slide, is that there are really tremendous opportunities for us to re-examine how we want to move into the future. So there will be a number of innovations already in industries, some of which I've already mentioned, healthcare and well-being products and services, but also impact investing, supply chain resiliency, climate adaptation, AI, and more. And that really leads us in higher ed to acknowledge the crucial role that we play, because it means that some of these jobs haven't even been created that are going to solve these challenges or address some of these opportunities. And so we hope that they will be filled by our graduates. And so it's really our job to prepare them with the critical skill sets that they are going to need to tackle these challenges. And so how can Lafayette really better align our values as an institution and our commitment to creating a more just and verdant world? We think that we're in a good position to do that. Next slide. We believe that we can do so by building on our existing strengths of interdisciplinary, curricular, and co-curricular excellence. And because this human health crisis really underscores the importance of building capacities and resilience to deal with low probability scenarios and high probability scenarios, it really means that preparing for the future is crucial to start doing right now, today, tomorrow. And we can really do that by focusing on just a few really core trends, but I think I'm probably missing many, many more. So as I mentioned before, accelerating our transition to renewable energy is one. Focusing on zero waste and circular economies is another way that we can really be preparing for the future. Innovating in the healthcare sector to ensure affordable access to services and products, and ensuring investment in our infrastructure and the industries coming out of the pandemic are really tied to climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. So with that, I will pass the presentation back to Kira to discuss our potential paths forward.
As the cartoon we shared on the first slide suggests, climate change is a slower moving, but in many respects, maybe even higher stakes than this disaster that we find ourselves in at the moment. With the climate crisis, there are irreversible tipping points that await us, as I noted earlier in the presentation. And there will be ongoing threats in terms of extreme weather events and rising sea levels, food and water shortages and insecurities for many, many people all over the world. And so when we think about the economic recovery as a consequence of the moment that we are in, right? How are we going to recover from the pandemic, which has had untold hardship on people all over the world? What we do now will really shape economies, carbon emissions, and lives for decades to come. And I and many others in the environmental community really see there are kind of two pathways forward. Pathway one is the sort of familiar one. This acute economic distress leads to a rapid return to what we call BAU, or business as usual, right? A very carbon intensive approach with emissions ramping back up steeply. And this figure over here on the right-hand portion of your slide, which has years on the bottom, so 1960 starting here, moving towards the present, towards the right, and billions of metric tons of carbon dioxide on the vertical axis. And you can see that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been rising steadily, but you can also see that there are these swales that exist as a consequence of some major events that have happened in history, including the recession in 2008. You can see that there are little divots that occur with these events, which illustrate drops in carbon emissions as a consequence of these events. But what we also see is a steep rise in carbon emissions in the wake of these previous events. And so the historical record suggests that pathway one is the most likely scenario. But what I would submit is that the environmental community would argue that we ardently that we need to choose a different path in this case. We need to choose pathway 2, which is to use this recovery as a way to transform our economies to dramatically reduce carbon emissions. And as I noted before, and Delicia actually elucidated some of the specific examples, there are many different ways in which we could do this at all different levels of governments all over the world. This transition from a fossil fuel intensive economy to one that is renewable based and clean energy based is inevitable. And if we do it now, it will keep us from reaching some of those tipping points that I talked about earlier. I would say that as a climate scientist, this spring was deeply alarming. I know it was alarming for everybody, but as a climate scientist who has long been thinking about a future in which we don't mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis, watching this accelerated version of a massive human disruption as a consequence of a pandemic and the unbelievable hardship that has been experienced by people all over the world felt like a very fast version of the climate crisis. But I think for many of us in the environmental community, we have concerns that the genies that are going to be unleashed by climate change are not going to go back in the bottle as a consequence of a vaccine or some sort of innovation. And so these irreversible tipping points definitely give us some significant concern. And so that makes me and my colleagues at Lafayette deeply motivated to educate the next generation about how they can handle these circumstances, COVID-19-like events, and the climate crisis and other environmental challenges that they are going to inherit when they become the folks who are out in the world as citizens. So at Lafayette, we have, over the last decade, sought to embrace sustainability as one of our core values. On the top portion of this slide is just the statement that exists on the college's website. And we believe quite firmly with deep conviction that the problems of the future, like COVID-19, like climate change, are not going to be solved by individuals within disciplinary silos, but are going to be solved by people who are willing to collaborate and people with different expertise that are working together to protect the common good. And we think that Lafayette's unique blend of liberal arts and engineering actually makes us really well situated to lead in this space. So we have, the ability to understand the problems from lots of different disciplinary lenses and work together collectively in that space in between, that interdisciplinary space, to develop new solutions. So I actually love this tagline from the most recent campaign, "Live Connected." That is absolutely the world that we live in today, and we need to embrace that is true and lead change. And so what we hope to do as educators is to prepare students to work in a world in which they're gonna have to think about these complex problems, and they're comfortable with working with others to think about problems in their communities and in the different places that they exist as citizens. One of Lafayette's big activities in the recent past as an effort to deliver on its commitment to sustainability was the unanimous approval by the Board of Trustees of the Climate Action Plan. This happened last February. And I'm pleased to say that the college has acted swiftly to try and implement the Climate Action Plan, some of the main elements of it. And so as of this February, we partnered with some other schools in the Eastern Pennsylvania, so Muhlenberg, Lehigh, and Dickinson, to sign a power purchase agreement to basically offset all of our emissions from electricity by the year 2022. And we are seeking ultimately to achieve carbon neutrality by 2035, which basically means that we will have net zero carbon emissions. Many other elements of the Climate Action Plan are already in the works on campus. We are working to implement, and we'll likely soon sign a contract to implement an on-site solar array on campus, which will provide educational benefits for students across a spectrum of different disciplines, and will serve as a visual display and reminder to everybody of Lafayette's commitment to sustainability, as well as a conversation starter about the importance of confronting these environmental challenges that we see in the world. We are deeply committed to educating students to grapple with these challenges, and just giving examples that relate specifically to sustainability. So over the most of the last decade, There have been a number of workshop-based model courses that have students working in teams to solve problems in our community, both right on Lafayette's campus as well as in the surrounding communities. So just by way of example, you know, the very first environmental capstone course was called Greening Lafayette, and which was co-taught by myself and Professor Ben Cohen. And we had our students use their environmental knowledge to develop basically a co-curricular program to introduce our campus, students campus-wide to sustainability concepts. And elements of that capstone class are being implemented in our sustainability efforts here at Lafayette today. As another example, one that engages the community, my colleague again, Ben Cohen, with another colleague, Julia Nicodemus, they worked with the city of Easton to develop a climate change vulnerability assessment for the city. So, you know, in student evaluations and reflections that students have had about these courses that they've shared with me and with us, they really appreciate the chance to have a team-based and community-focused, hands-on opportunity to work on a problem that actually will contribute to the greater good in our community. And those skills, based upon sort of feedback from some alums out in the world, were really, really important to them in terms of thinking about their career paths and in terms of thinking about, you know, how they might engage in their professional communities moving forward. We seek to do and work with students in the classroom to try and impart some of these skills that we think will be a very important part of their toolkit moving forward. And we also seek to engage with students in a co-curricular way, right? Not within the classroom, but sort of touching upon their experience at Lafayette as students in every facet of their existence. And so some great examples of our efforts to do that are connected to Lafayette's College Farm and to our sustainable food loop on Lafayette's campus. So this is actually an amazing story of a couple of grassroots efforts by faculty-student partnerships. So Jen Bell, who is a graduate of Lafayette for the class of 2010, in 2009, she worked with David Brandis, who's pictured over here, with some students putting up some solar panels at La Farm to start our Lafayette College Farm. And in about the same time, Art Kanai, another professor at Lafayette, worked with some students to start our on-campus composting program. In 2011, those grassroots efforts, faculty-student partnerships and ideas that students had about, hey, why don't we have a college farm? And professors saying, that's a great idea, let's make that happen. Or why aren't we composting? Let's make that happen. Those two projects came together with Bon Appetit, who is our current food service provider, in 2011, started what's called the Sustainable Food Loop. So food that's grown at La Farm is then, you know, served in our dining halls, and the food waste that's collected from our dining halls is combined with yard waste and wood chips in our composters, and then that compost is spread back out on the farm fields to provide nutrients for growing the vegetables that will start the loop over again. This is a great illustration of something we call a cradle-to-cradle system, right? So we have a closed loop, and we are basically working to use what would be deemed in any other context as waste products as actually something that rejuvenates the cycle all over again. So this is a model of a sustainable environmental system, and it is a sort of a cornerstone model for us, and one that we are seeking to replicate in other elements of our sustainability efforts on campus. And we think it's really a beautiful illustration of opportunities for students and faculty to work together to sort of, you know, move our environmental community at Lafayette forward. I'm going to turn it back over to Delicia here to talk about our Vegetables and Communities program, which is related to our efforts at La Farm.
Thanks. So this is another wonderful project that is tied to La Farm, and it really seeks to create greater access to healthy food in Easton and educate residents about healthy diets. And it's done in partnership with the city of Easton. So Vegetables in the Community program allows Lafayette students to both grow and distribute food weekly throughout the summer to the Easton community. And it really demonstrates Lafayette's commitment to sustainability and also to the Easton community. Excel students that were assigned to VIC this summer were actually the only Excel students that were permitted to work this summer. As you can imagine, there were a number of impacts to students staying on campus and working on campus and doing research on campus. And so we felt that that was really a demonstration of both the ability to work at La Farm safely, but also the need that we are helping to fill in the Easton community. Next slide. In addition to students working at La Farm and through the Vegetables and Community program, we actually have a wide array of student interests. So this alphabet soup of student organizations, as we fondly call them, illustrates really the varied array of interests in sustainability, from food security and food waste to seed saving, beekeeping, zero waste, banning plastic, behavior change, and more. In addition, through the Office of Sustainability, we hire between 12 and 15 sustainability peer educators every academic year to really set the tone on campus from the first day of orientation all the way through the end of senior week. Another example of students' engagement and passion for sustainability is demonstrated through the associated student body forming a subcommittee focused on sustainability, and they've really been a great partner this past year in particular. And then also, you know, the senior class gift, one of the senior class gift options this year was to give to sustainability. And again, we just are appreciative of the interest and engagement that Lafayette students want with sustainability and how they hope to support it. We do also have a number of initiatives and aspirations that we are trying to engage students in. So Kira, next slide, please. So the three biggest ones that we are focused on in the short term, really leading into long term, of course, is we're working very diligently to advance the goals of the Climate Action Plan 2.0, as Kira discussed a bit about on a few slides previous to this one. We're also incredibly focused on enhancing the on-campus student experience. So again, engaging students in piloting sustainability solutions on campus, and then hopefully taking them up to larger scales if they are successful, like pollinator gardens or the composting program that Kira had mentioned. We're also looking to create additional leadership opportunities for students that are interested in sustainability, like a sustainability fellowship program, which we don't yet have, but we think could have a lot of potential on campus. And then really, strengthening our curricular and co-curricular opportunities through partnerships. So that's both with the City of Easton, but also a number of nonprofits in the region, as well as a lot of on-campus departments as well. So the Lambda Center for Community Engagement, the Dyer Center, and many, many more important departments. So next slide, we invite you as we kind of wrap up this webinar to really stay connected to the Lafayette sustainability community. There are a menu of options for any one of you that would like to either get engaged or stay engaged. So that could be anything from serving as a guest speaker or sharing your sustainability story. There is a link on the sustainability website, and before this webinar is over, I will put the link also in the chat. We'd love to know what your interest in sustainability is, whether it's on a personal level or professional level. If you come to campus, and we hope you do, there are lots of opportunities to volunteer, whether it's at La Farm or elsewhere. We invite you to advise students in one of the projects that they may be working on tied to sustainability. There are lots of students that are seeking mentorship to learn about their potential pathways forward. Sponsoring internships or jobs are always welcome, especially if they are tied to sustainability, since we do have students that are really eager to align their values with their degree program. And then lastly, if time is not necessarily what you have, but you feel that your contribution is through a financial donation, as you can see, we have a number of priority areas. And I know that students and the rest of the community are of course, very appreciative of any support to see their programs through to fruition. So with that, I think we will maybe stop and take some questions.
While people are considering questions to submit down in the chat down below, I'm going to pull up our poll question from earlier and share the results. So the question was, how was your quarantine cooking / baking? And it seems like most people burned their food some of the time. I'm sure everyone's cooking skills will become better as we move along. Okay, we have one question. It says, what can we do as individuals to make an impact immediately?
Delicia, do you want me to take that one, or do you want to take that one?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and take that one?
I think there are lots of different ways to have an impact individually, immediately. Some of those involve being involved in your communities. So at every level of government, I think government needs to understand about sustainability issues and challenges that exist. You know, I'm a climate scientist, so I'm gonna plug the climate crisis. There is a dire need for rapid transformation of our infrastructure away from fossil fuels. There are a lot of incentives that exist in many states for that to happen. So local municipalities, if you are in one of those states, you could encourage your local municipalities to engage in those types of you know, opportunities that exist. For instance, solar panels and all sorts of infrastructure changes that could be helped by governments and resources and grants and whatnot. So that's not hard. You just have to pick up the phone and do it. And if enough people do it, then that moves us towards action. I would submit that that's true at every level of government, right? That your representatives, they represent you, and hearing from you is an important part of how our democracy functions in a way that we want it to. So a big plug for We the People and having We the People's voices heard by the folks who are in a position to make decisions about what your priorities are. From the standpoint of you as an individual, it depends a little bit upon where you are in your life path, but a whole spectrum of different opportunities are available for individual action. So if you're at the point in your life in which you own your own home, there are all sorts of improvements that you can make that would allow you to actually, in the long haul, save quite a lot of money, from updating your boiler to buying Energy Star appliances when you're replacing your appliances, or moving towards a more fuel efficient vehicle. Either I would recommend a plug-in hybrid or an electric car. All of those things in the long haul will actually save you money. And at the moment, depending upon what state you live in, but at the moment, many of the states in the northeastern part of our country where Lafayette is, and many of our students are from, there are incentives that exist at the state level and also at the federal level to help with some of those efforts. If you're not yet at the point in your life where you own your own home and are making those, or own your own car even, decisions that you can make in terms of your own behavior can definitely have an impact. You know, it sounds like it might not matter that much, but there was a recent study about the impact of climate change on land surfaces, and there was a big focus on the amount of land that we use for meat production, right? Raising animals for meat consumption. And that's actually a pretty big part of the global methane budget, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. So in fact, changing your diet can have a pretty big effect on your own personal carbon footprint. Changing your transportation, thinking about changing all your light bulbs, for instance, over from, if you have incandescents, or moving towards more LED type or compact fluorescent light bulbs can definitely help with your energy budget, and being very thoughtful about what you have plugged in all over your house, and what you're fulsome picture of your electricity footprint is. Delicia, you're as a sustainability director, I'm sure I forgot some things, and maybe you want to kind of add a few things here. So I'll pause and let you chime in.
I mean, I think those are all great suggestions. I think in line with maybe some of the content from this presentation, but also maybe some of the observations that you may have made while you were at home. You know, I think thinking about what materials you need versus what you want is really important, and that's kind of part of the zero waste journey. I have spoken to a lot of friends that have felt that they've learned a lot about how much waste they produce because they're at home all the time. And so it kind of gives us the ability to take a step back and think about where we may be able to make some different decisions from a procurement perspective. You know, from a carbon emissions, you know, larger view perspective, certainly what you eat, kind of your sources of food could really have a big impact as well. So that's always something to think about from an individual level and what you feel comfortable pivoting around.
I would add that CSAs and buying local are definitely ways to decrease food miles and know where your food is coming from, and also support your local economy. And so that's another good individual action that you could take, even if you're just out of school or still in school. Those are ways to have an impact.
We have a question from Emily Henry. She says, I live in an area of the country with a high population of climate deniers. What do you think is the best way to discuss sustainability with these folks?
Hi, Emily. So, you know, that's certainly challenging than living in a place where everybody understands that climate change is happening. I think two things. One is that, you know, despite a pretty substantive and extensive effort by, you know, special interests who seek to lose as a consequence of people actually understanding climate change, you know, a lot of data suggests that people are starting to trust their own experience in the world, and that people's views of climate change are evolving, even in places where there are, you know, it seems to be that there are lots of folks who are not thinking that climate change is happening. And so what I would say is that, you know, you may have to sort of suss out the conversations that you're in and think about whether or not there is an opportunity to really talk with someone about what you know. And I, having worked with you, I know you know quite a lot about the climate system and climate change. And so I think, you know, sort of listening first is important. And also a really important entree into a conversation with someone about climate is to talk about something that you both care about, right? So you got to start with the values rather than starting with the science. And that often helps you get to a place where you're talking about something you both care about, and then it's easier for those people to be listening. So I think thinking about what you have in common with that person you're having a conversation with, and starting at that point, and then sort of diplomatically moving the conversation in a direction in which you might offer some insight from the knowledge that you have. And I guess what I'd also say is that, you know, these are conversations that we hope you're going to have in an ongoing way, right? So that you're going to start a conversation, and you're going to start a relationship, and you're going to, you know, sort of move the needle a little bit. And then in a subsequent conversation, again, leading with values that you share with that person, you're going to work to continue to help have that person think a little more fulsomely about the evidence that exists for climate change. And I think a point of connectivity there is people's lived experience in the world, right? And as we are watching happen on our planet right now, there are quite a few distressing examples of extreme weather events that are unprecedented, right? So, you know, working from those examples, especially ones that are not too far away, you know, I'm thinking wildfires in the Western US might be a good example as a place to enter that conversation. The other thing I would say is that depending upon where you are, you know, what municipality that you live in, there are ways for communities to move towards a more sustainable future that don't actually involve any conversation about climate change, right? And so depending upon what community you're in, you might be able to have an impact on reducing the carbon intensity of that, you know, local government or your township, or what the regulations are for businesses in your part of the world that probably ultimately are going to save those businesses money, but are going to also transition to a less carbon intensive future. And so that's another approach that you can take in a place where you don't feel like there are lots of people who are thinking that climate change is a problem, is that you can sort of lead with some of the solutions that are revenue beneficial for individuals as well as for governments, that will allow, you know, your community to transition towards a less carbon intensive future, but don't involve thorny conversations about climate change with climate deniers. And I would submit that some of the goodwill and trust that may well be built in a conversation that would involve, you know, promoting solar panels or putting up a wind turbine, or, you know, something as simple as, you know, some sort of policy that changes over insulation in businesses in your community that ultimately are going to save people money, might allow you to later have more deep conversations about the climate crisis after those people get to know you and trust you. Delicia, do you want to add anything there?
I couldn't have said it better myself. The only thing that I would maybe add is just some examples of what Kira had said, is really that sustainability is really, it can be seen as a value kind of initiative, but I would say more than that, it is good for business. And that could both be the bottom line, but it's also what we also found from the 2008 economic crisis is that companies that had more deeply integrated sustainability into their business model, whether that was supply chain or that was employee engagement efforts or compensation, any of those kind of sustainability metrics at the corporate level, actually did better, meaning their profits didn't go down as much. They had more cash flow than a lot of their peers that didn't as deeply integrate sustainability. So I think if it's going to resonate with the other person, really talking about how sustainability is good for the bottom line is a great kind of way to continue the conversation, and also just mitigating risk. You know, thinking about sustainability and thinking about resilient supply chains are good for business, and they mitigate future risk because we can never predict what scenario is really going to be in front of us. Just a small example here in the Lehigh Valley is that there was a coalition of Democrats and Republicans that voted to support a very small tax to preserve open space. That we thought that was going to be a huge uphill battle, and it wasn't easy, but there are lots of ways in which people that may not think about climate change, but may think about some physical asset that they can see and understand that, for example, open space helps with water retention, which means that there won't have to be emergency repairs, which are really expensive and could increase your taxes if there's enough of those events, et cetera, can be a way to really connect. So I agree with Kira that, you know, finding something that is tangible that might resonate with that person that you're talking to is just a really good place to start from.
We have a few more questions. Ellen Weiler would like to know, is there any need for the recipients of food from La Farm to know how to prepare the food?
So I can try to respond to that question. So one thing that my colleague actually in the Geology department, Larry Malanconico, who runs a technology clinic at Lafayette, which was the genesis point for this Vegetables in the Community program, and also Ben Cohen, who I referenced earlier, who's one of the environmental faculty at Lafayette, they co-run this Vegetables in the Community program. And the program has evolved significantly over time. One of the things that they offer when they have the basically farmers market that they have in Easton are recipes about how to prepare the food that is basically available at the market. So they're sort of thinking about how to provide opportunities for people to access that food and utilize it in a healthy and tasty way. And that's certainly something that they have given quite a bit of thought to. Delicia, do you want to add anything there?
It is tied to the question, but you know, through La Farm, you are able to donate a weekly box of produce to our food pantry, the PARD pantry, for students that are staying over the summer. And we thought about the value of not only giving the students the food so that they can prepare it in the kitchen that they're using, but also some suggestions for recipes and other kind of helpful suggestions. So I think that recognizing that just offering up a service or an item like food is not really enough for some of our student population. So I think what we're hoping to do as we see our weekly boxes continue into the fall semester for either students to purchase or for others to purchase and donate to students that might be utilizing PARD Pantry, is to maybe also not just provide the recipes, but also maybe some cooking lessons or some other kind of educational resources that might be helpful to students. And it could be current Lafayette students who already love cooking, sharing some recipes with current students that maybe don't feel as comfortable in the kitchen through virtual cooking or cooking shows or whatever, cook-offs. So we'll see how we can be creative this fall.
And just as a point of clarification, so the Vegetables and Community program has been running for a number of years, and that has provided food for our neighbors in the Easton area community. There is a weekly farmers market throughout the summer, and some of our students have worked directly with that program as Excel scholars, and have worked both at La Farm and also at the Easton area urban farm. And those foods are accessible to our neighbors in the Easton community. And then Delicia was just talking about the PARD Pantry, which is a fairly recent initiative to help students on campus who are food insecure, some of whom are still actually at Lafayette because for whatever circumstances are challenging at home as a consequence of the pandemic. That effort at sustainability and having the PARD Pantry be accessible was really very fortuitously timed, such that it was initiated kind of right before the pandemic happened. And Lisa Miskelly, who works in Delicia's office, and Delicia worked with the folks who run the PARD Pantry to forge this partnership between La Farm and the PARD Pantry to supply food and as Delicia noted, recipes for the students on campus to have fresh food from right up the road at their college farm. So that's sort of a recent blending between sustainability and COVID-19 response in our community. And as Delicia noted, our friends in the sustainability office, she and Lisa Miskelly are thinking about creative ways to make it even more impactful as we move towards the heart of the summer and into the fall.
I have another question. This is, can you talk a little bit more about the irreversible impacts / thresholds related to climate change? What are the most concerning potential impacts climate scientists are seeing?
Sure. Oh gosh. Okay. So I think the kind of longest term, but maybe most concerning because of the number of people who live in coastal zones the world over, is long-term sea level rise. And so we are probably already at a point where we're close to the Greenland ice sheet being unstable. So the Greenland ice sheet holds 7 meters of sea level. The good news is that ice sheets take a long time to go away. The bad news is that 7 meters multiplied by 3.3, and then you have the number of feet there, right? So we're talking quite a lot of sea level rise as a consequence of losing these ice sheets. So that's Greenland. West Antarctica is also at risk. That's 5 meters of sea level, again, multiplied by 3.3, and we're talking about, in the high teens of sea level there. So if you just look at a map of coastlines around the world and a look at the density of population along shorelines, there will be dramatic impacts for much of the world's population as a consequence of long-term sea level rise. And it will be quite difficult. And one of the challenges in the climate system is that there are these lags, right? After you change what's called the forcing, the input, it takes some time for the climate system to catch up to that. So even if we, and there are many smart people working on this, find a way to start stripping carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, it will take quite a long while for those changes to then help us stop losing ice in Greenland and in Antarctica. And so that's one that is kind of out there on the horizon. But the challenge is that in this moment that we are in now with the greenhouse gas concentrations, what they are, we are kind of close to the threshold in which Greenland becomes unstable. And we're also, glaciologists are sort of watching that happen in real time in those high latitude places. So that's one that I worry quite a lot about. I think that the other main concern, a big concern for me, is how quickly the biosphere adapts and migrates. And so there is a real intersection point between the climate crisis and the biodiversity loss crisis. So there are many organisms, when the climate changes, organisms either migrate, adapt, or perish. And, looking back in time, which is, I study climate of the past, so we have many colleagues who also study organisms in the past. Looking at the time periods in the past in which climate has changed rapidly, we see the biosphere shift quite dramatically, right? The boreal forest that is now in Canada during the last ice age was, down in the southeastern part of the United States. And as the climate warmed in the wake of that change, we saw a dramatic migration of the different biomes of the vegetation biosphere across landscapes all over the world. So I think the thing about the climate crisis right now is that the rate of change is unprecedented in our knowledge of the geologic record, right? We are 10 times to 15 times as fast as the fastest example that we see in the geologic record. So as in many instances in the past of rapid climate change, when we watch big impacts of the biosphere, there's a lot of migration happening, but there were also organisms who perished. Now that we have, are experiencing this very rapid rate of change of the climate, it is an open question what elements of the biosphere can respond. And there have been quite a few studies seeking to answer exactly that question. Distressingly, many of the plants who are the base of food chains all over the world are at risk of not being able to migrate fast enough to keep up with the rate of change of the climate. And so that will result in a lot of mortality of organisms, both the plants, which are at the base of the food chain, and then the animals and the kind of ecosystems that depend upon those plants to function. And so those two are really ones that I think are distressingly worrisome, and are ones that you don't get to bring back species that have gone extinct. So I could go on and on, but I think those two are the ones that probably are most worrisome to me. I would note that I think another big worry is the long-term security of global food supplies. We've had some conversations with Lisa Miskelly, who's the Lafayette College farmer, works in the sustainability office. We've talked about food shortages that exist in the world at this moment, and it's not news to any of us that there are many people in the world and even in the United States who are food insecure. But as Lisa says, that's a distribution problem, right? I think my worry for the future about food supplies, if we don't confront the climate crisis, is that we won't just be talking about a distribution problem, we will be talking about a supply problem as well. And that will be, I think, even more intense than the sort of dreadful food insecurity problems that already exist in the world as a consequence of insufficient distribution and sort of supply chain infrastructure at the moment. Delicia, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you said it well.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions we have for tonight. I want to thank Delicia and Kira for this great information. You gave us a lot of things to think about and some great action plans.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure, sure.
So I think one of the things that, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your closing remarks.
No worries.
But I just gave a very sort of sobering response to I think a very serious question, right? But I guess what I'd say is that Delicia and I and our colleagues at Lafayette, right? Now is not a time for despair, right? Now is a time for action. And so what I would submit is that we have at our disposal the tools that we need to confront the climate crisis and many of these other environmental crises. So what we lack is the will to implement those changes. And what I would say is that there is no better time than right now in this moment to use your voice and your interest in a sustainable future to work for change, and to advocate for using the technological developments that smart engineers and scientists and innovators the world over have developed to confront these challenges, and actually demand action now, right, of our governments who represent us, the people, right? So I guess my my closing remarks are to be participants and not spectators, right? Many of my students some of whom are on this call have heard me say that before, right? But now is a time to engage, not to disengage. Now is a time to be hopeful and active, not to despair. And I hope if I could leave you with anything, we exist in this challenging moment, right? The pandemic has laid that bare, and the climate crisis will similarly lay that bare. But we also collectively have an opportunity to change the future in a way that human societies in the years to come will prosper, and that is our opportunity in this moment in time. And I would submit that we should all embrace it, right, in whatever way that we can, in whatever facet of our existence that we live in whatever place that we're living in the world. Now is a time for action and engagement, and for building a future that we would be proud to leave to our children and our grandchildren. Thank you for letting me say that.
Do you have any parting words? No.
Who could possibly top Kira's passion, insight, and intelligence? I'm gonna leave it with Kira and you.
Okay. I do want to let folks know that we have recorded this session, and we will make it available on our website. So please feel free to share, particularly, as one of our participants said, she lives in an area with a lot of climate deniers. Perhaps sharing some of this information will help enlighten some folks. So I really do hope that everyone here tonight share with the greater Lafayette and non-Lafayette community, and get them involved both at Lafayette with sustainability, but also just in the greater world of climate change. Since folks here, I imagine, definitely have an interest in sustainability, have an interest in what has happened with the pandemic, have an interest of food, I want to point out 2 future talks that are coming up that will be of interest. One is on July 8th with Professor Ben Cohen, talking about his book, Pure Adulteration, Cheating on Nature in the Age of Manufactured Food. And on July 23rd, we have 4 alumni from the Sustainability Center in Washington, D.C., talking about the effects on the effects of the pandemic on the global workforce. And that would include warehouse workers, as well as food workers outside of the US. So I think both of those would be very interesting talks. And I see we have Jeff from the Solidarity Center actually on, on tonight's talk. So thank you again, everyone. And you can view those events and register for them, as well as other future events, by visiting leopardlink.org/events.